Hello. So in this video I'm going to talk about Sarah Ruhl's play In the Next Room, or the Vibrator play. This is, to me, one of the great pieces of contemporary American theater. And Sarah Ruhl is one of the greatest American playwrights. In the Next Room is set in the 1880s at a time when you had a sort of confluence of scientific developments, medical technology, and the early sort of phases of conflict over gender roles, particularly things like women's liberation, women's rights, and things like this. So it's an interesting transition period, because with the Industrial Revolution you start to have a rapidly developing technology. And so what we get in the play is Dr. Gibbings, who's a medical doctor who primarily treats hysteria. Now, hysteria is an interesting disease. It has a long, interesting history, primarily being diagnosed in women, and going back to at least the ancient Greeks, the belief was that one of the major treatments for hysteria was orgasm. And so the medical treatment for hysteria tended to be inducing an orgasm in one way or another. Whether that was through sex in marriage, or whether that was by the doctor themselves, whether that was through the use of water-based machines of different kinds. There's actually a really fascinating book on this, which is called, let me just find the title of it real quick. Because it's in one of the notes at the beginning here. Yes, The Technology of Orgasm by Rachel P. Maines. It's a really fascinating book. And basically it sort of traces a long history of orgasm and the technologies for inducing orgasm in women as a treatment for hysteria. And one of the most interesting components of it is the way that medical texts traditionally talk about this in non-sexual terms. So what, for the most part, today we would consider a deeply sexual act, they saw as an asexual medical treatment. And that's what Dr. Gibbings does. He uses early forms of electric vibrators as his sort of chosen methodology. At the same time, in the room outside his operating theater, he is not a particularly attentive husband. So his wife, Catherine, has a lot of these sort of hysterical symptoms because she feels extremely cut off from family life. And in the 19th century, she is a deeply 19th century woman. Women were supposed to derive identity, meaning, social function, etc., from their domestic relationships. So relationships with husbands, relationships with children. Catherine doesn't have that much of a relationship with her new baby because she's not been able to produce enough milk to feed the baby, and so they had to hire a wet nurse. And there's a lot that can be said about the role of the wet nurse, who's a really fascinating character in her own right. But I'm not going to cover her that much in this video, apart from saying that this relationship and the fact that the baby, Charlotte, or Lottie, takes to the wet nurse in a way she didn't take to Catherine. And so Catherine develops a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of self-esteem issues because this relationship deteriorates. She also doesn't have a fulfilling interpersonal relationship with her husband, who's much more work-oriented. And so while there's a lot of stuff in here that's really, really fascinating about the nature of art, about the domestic and public politics of the Victorian era, and so on and so on. This, for me, is the central conflict, is this inability for Catherine to connect meaningfully with other people. And to me, this is a quintessentially third wave feminist play. And I have an article I'm working on about this play, and that's essentially the sort of idea that I advance in that article, is that Ruhl uses the socio-cultural divisions of Victorian ideology and the physical divisions of their house to explore this third wave feminist alternative to a traditional gender binary. So when I say third wave feminist, I'm talking about this sort of idea of postmodern gender fluidity, gender as performative, gender as a social construct, and so on and so on, coming out of people like Judith Butler, Jack Halberstam, people like this. We're sort of challenging these much more traditional, rigid concepts of gender as biological or gender as socially, or gender as external to society. So in this house, it's a really interesting house because there are two rooms. There's the living room and the operating theater, representing the private sphere of the living room, the domestic, and the public sphere of the scientific or the external, the world of business. But they exist under the same roof. And so in this way, the public, the external, has invaded the internal, the domestic. But there's a door between them. And so they're still distinctly separated spaces. And that separation, that door, represents the gap between Dr. Givings and Catherine. She's on the one side of the door, he's on the other, and they can't find a way to connect because of that sort of physical separation, which also embodies an ideological separation. However, at the end of the play, things come to a climax. We've got issues of jealousy, we've got issues of, again, Catherine's depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. Dr. Givings becomes increasingly alienated and frustrated. And so we finally have a resolution. And I think it's a beautifully third wave feminist resolution as well, because it poses an alternative. So they have their sort of final hashing it out moment, and what happens is that Mrs. Givings, Catherine, basically establishes that all she really wants is an interpersonal relationship. Dr. Givings realizes that he hasn't done anything to facilitate this. And so we've got two things here that I think are really, really crucial. One is that Dr. Givings gives this weird poem. So he's a man of science. He's not artistic, he's not expressive, etc., etc. But his poem that he gives, or he extemporaneously makes up for Catherine, is as he kisses each place on her face, he uses the scientific names. He says, "I bless the temporomandibular joint. I bless the buccal artery and nerve. I bless the depressor anguli oris. I bless the zygomatic arch. I bless the temporalis fasciae. I bless the Catherine." And it's this moment that blurs boundaries. Dr. Givings doesn't here give up being the scientist. He's still the scientist with the Latin names, or these official names, but he redeploys that under the sign of art, the sign of poetry. But then we also have a temporal, or we have a spatial shift here. They leave the main house and they go out to the winter garden. And the stage directions here are really, really interesting, because they go out to this winter garden. And the stage direction says, "Although the domestic space seemed terribly permanent, a settee, a statuette, suddenly it disappears and we are in a sweet small winter garden. Snow covers trees that in the spring flower with pink flowers." And in this winter garden, they get undressed, they have sex, the first meaningful sex that they've ever had in their married lives. But what I find really, really evocative about this space is that it's both and neither public and private. So that's, again, for me, one of the big sort of dichotomies of the play is the public versus the private space of the domestic household in the living room versus the operating theater with its public associations with medicine and business. The Winter Garden is private in the sense that they own it, it is their exclusive space, but it's also public in the sense that it's open to the world. It is outdoors. And Dr. Givings actually says the street lamps are coming on. Someone will see us. And so that sort of notion of a third term, neither public nor private, and yet both public and private, is very much a sort of third wave feminist idea. This notion that there are alternatives and that things are fluid rather than static, stable, and exclusively one thing or another is really central both to third wave feminism and to In the Next Room.